Start. Thanks.
Okay, welcome everyone. Today's design and dialogue will be roughly 45 minutes and followed by a Q&A section. We'll be recording this for archive and anyone who misses this meeting. We're also muting everyone except our hosts, Glenn and Chris, today to ensure audio clarity for everyone. And if you want to ask Chris any questions, please type them in the chat and we'll go through them during the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucy. Thank you everyone for tuning in. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning with Schanck, who is based in Detroit, and a series of design and dialogue conversations. Last week we had Misha Khan, and next week we're going to feature 3 guests. We're going to be going to a 3 times per week schedule for the duration of the virus lockdown. And so we'll be hosting Zoe Ryan on Monday at 11, and then we will have Faye Toogood, the British designer, on Wednesday. And then from Brazil, we'll have Humberto Campana joining us on Friday. But today we are fortunate to be joined by Chris. Hi, Chris, how are you doing?
Hey, Glenn. It's a good lineup.
Thank you. Great to see you. And I thought you could just start out by giving us a little tour of your studio from your comfortable perch there.
Okay. So I'm in our main sort of fabrication space, and we have some projects. Next to me, there's a chair. There's another chair. I think this is the edge of a mirror, and we have a cabinet over here. These are sort of in various stages of finishing.
And usually that space is a hive of activity, I think it's fair to say.
It's just, you couldn't hear in here right now on a normal day, just a lot sort of going on, machines running and people just swarming around projects.
And we'll get back to the way that you've built your studio over the years in a few minutes, but just give us a sense of how many people are there on the average day and what kind of things they're doing.
Right now we're about 10, and people are working on any level of projects. We have people sitting at computers doing some design work, people in the sort of just welding, sort of engineering frames for things, people in a resining process room. We have a whole foiling finishing team in the next room who's camped out in there. So it's everything. You could come in any day and see things at any sort of stage in the process to get a sense of how the work's made.
Great. I did want to just pause and say that folks, as Lucy said, should ask questions as we go along in the chat box. And also feel free to share any other greetings, comments, links to things you might find interesting. So you might think of that as like the crawl at the bottom of the CNN news feed as Chris and I talk. So Chris, you went to school not too far away from your studio in Cranbrook. Can you just give us a little bit of a sense of what brought you there and how you ended up being a designer in the first place? What interested you in the field?
Okay. Well, I grew up in Dallas, Texas, or outside of Dallas, Texas, and a town called The Colony, which is kind of a rural suburb. I don't know what you call that. It was very sort of bizarre sort of development in the middle of sort of the country. And I found this amazing arts magnet school in downtown Dallas called Booker T. Washington, which sort of saved my life and gave me sort of a trajectory. So I went there, and that sort of launched me to grad school. I met a recruiter from SVA there, and so I went to New York to the School of Visual Arts and studied painting and sculpture. And then I just sort of kicked around the city working for artist museums and had a studio. I went for a master's at Central St. Martin's in London, which I sort of promptly dropped out of. I had this sort of crisis of faith, I think at that time, of what I was doing as an artist. I didn't know what I wanted to say or what I wanted to do. And so I dropped out of that program, worked for a really great art fabrication studio in London, and was sort of getting more and more interested in design on my periphery. I was meeting sort of designers and architects. I went back to New York, put together a good enough portfolio to get into grad school. I got accepted to Cranbrook. I picked Cranbrook. It was my best option, to be honest. And it was the furthest thing away from anything I knew, which I also thought was a good move.
Right. And so that was really the moment of shift from fine art to design as well, is that right?
Yeah, it was the shift. I was sort of interested in, I don't know, this design held this idea for me at the time of sort of experiencing an object. So I was making sculptures that you could interact with more and more, but it wasn't sort of explicit enough in that context. And sort of abstractly designed for me meant that sort of the experience of interacting with something held this other power. And so I don't know what that was, but yeah, I went to.
Yeah. So not a pure autonomous sculpture, but something that meets people halfway in their own everyday life in some sense.
Yes, very much. At first, I tried to make very sort of ubiquitous objects too, where it had no sense of authorship in the object, or the authorship wasn't important. But that was, I wasn't very good at that, but I think that taught me a lot in terms of, I tried to understand the way the design mind worked, that in that sort of way, which really helped me, I think, get outside of my own head and start to try and see and experience things through other people's perspectives, just become less of an egomaniac. And I think that helped in the process.
That's super interesting because the studio is this multi-perspectival meeting ground. And maybe we could now move on to the images, Lucy, if you don't mind queuing up the PowerPoint. And the first image we have kind of brings you right to the austerities of Detroit at a certain time of year and what you were facing when you came out of Cranbrook and came to this really super interesting neighborhood within Detroit, which is nicknamed Town. And I wonder if you could tell us about that move.
Okay, that's that move. All right, okay, yeah, so I graduated in 2011 and I didn't know where I was gonna go. I didn't really have a plan after school. When I left New York, I feel like I kind of burnt the bridge on the way out, and Detroit sort of offered it was a good option. It was my only option. I made some good friends here. I was adjunct teaching at the time, and a really good friend of mine, Peter, bought a house on the east side of Detroit. And in his words, he offered me free rent in exchange for sweat equity if I helped him fix it and moved in. So I took him up on that. He promptly left, took a job in New York, and sold me the house for what I could afford monthly. And so I moved down into this neighborhood without really experiencing Detroit while being a student at Cranbrook. So it was all very sort of new and foreign to me. And the neighborhood I moved into was known sort of locally as Banglatown. And that awful photo that you put in the presentation is me standing next to the official Banglatown sign, which sort of the community and small businesses raised money to make it sort of official, which it was such a like exciting move where it became, I don't know, had this official sort of sense of identity. I don't know, I felt like things were changing. It was a powerful gesture.
Right. Maybe we can go on to the next image. What you became known for very quickly was this technique called alufoil. It's a neologism, a word that you made up, obviously from aluminum foil. So this shows you creating the underlying structure, the substrate infrastructure of the piece. And if you go to the next slide, Lucy, here we see some early, these are quite early alufoil pieces that show the effect. And I wonder if you could just walk people through that process and how you arrived at it, and also what you found in it as you started to develop that vocabulary.
With those early works, I guess there was a couple things going on. We were really limited by what we had in terms of sort of tools or access to equipment. So the early forms took on a really sort of brutalist, straightforward form, things that we could cobble together. So this is just sort of found steel fence posts, recycled foam and foil, and the adhesive to stick it together. So we were working out of, at this time, that house that I had a 600 square foot studio attached to it, which used to be some kind of dry goods store in the neighborhood. So we worked out of that room with just sort of hand tools and some power tools. But the form was taking some inspiration from the surrounding area, where I think I was becoming really interested in this idea of these sort of infrastructure or pieces of architecture that were being shaped or misshapen over time due to sort of neglect or some trauma.
Lucy, maybe you could go to the next image. One of the things that I find fascinating about the series, the Alifoil series, is just that, the sense that you're elevating the wreckage or detritus that is finding its way into the studio. So materials that might otherwise have no value at all. And in fact, you're not even really adding precious materials to them because the foil itself is very inexpensive. The resin is an industrial material. And yet the result, as we see in these chairs, for example, is quite luxurious and even refers back to some of the apex moments of design history in terms of production values, like Art Deco, for example, or perhaps Baroque furniture. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, the intention there of taking really valueless trash and bringing it up to this kind of level of perfection or seduction.
Yeah, I think the perceived outcome of these pieces may be that they're luxurious, but they don't start off that way, or there are no traditional sense luxury items, so there's no rare precious materials in them, like you said. And I think the value, or what makes these valuable, is the people that and the work that goes into working with these materials. So these are a good example of that too, because these are an extension of our extended family of the studio. So we work with wonderful sort of outside metal fabricator, in this case, Lon Gothard, who formed the Saarinen-inspired shells, and then work with this fantastic upholsterer named Rod Klingerhofer in Dearborn, Michigan, who did the upholstery. And we took inspiration from the stitching of the aluminum shell and telegraphed that through to create the pattern. And finding and becoming friends with and working with these other sort of how do you say that, Glenn?
Entrepreneurial.
Yeah, what Glenn said. In the area, and it just, the work sort of takes on this collective quality that through, the way we make it and sort of the craft and care that we put into it makes it valuable. And they're inherently, the materials aren't valuable on their own.
I love the layering of that process, both conceptually and physically. So, here we have the Saarinen shell chair, Eric Saarinen's famous shell chairs, mid-century iconic designs that are hiding inside this totally different type of an object, which is vivid pink and has all of this handcrafted surfacing built around it. And then there's also the layering of the found objects. There's the layering of the people that have put their hands on these things together. So they're very multivalent works. Can you go to the next slide, Lucy? And we'll talk a little bit more about the studio in just a second, but just to give people a sense of a couple of the other expressions of this alifoil technique. Here you're actually starting to broaden the repertoire a little bit, and I think we have a detail of this, Lucy. You go to the next one. Can you talk a little bit about how alifoil developed over time as Esther, you sort of mastered it and found new potential in it as a vocabulary?
Yeah, I mean, the first pieces, like speaking of luxury, they were made out of Reynolds wrap aluminum foil I got from the grocery store. So as non-luxury as you can get. And they were kind of it was crudely sort of applied to the surface quickly and without a lot of sort of understanding of the process. The process being simple, but still invented. And I was doing it kind of on my own in the beginning, but quickly taking on assistants to help me make the work. And those assistants would sort of took over that part of the process and developed it, refined it, and became sort of a very, very idiosyncratic process that sort of skill set exceeded my own once other people in the studio took it over. And
then also mixing it with these other materials, so you have a palette, essentially, upholstery, as we saw in the last.
Yeah, I guess the other materials, that's kind of an abstraction of starting to look at material relationships in the neighborhood. So I think of kind of being symbiotic or more codependent things coming together. So this was looking at sort of the way trees or organic material was growing through fences, and the sort of beautiful sort of combination that happened, and the idea of sort of trying to take them apart would sort of damage either sort of the inanimate fence or the organic tree. So it's this kind of this union of these things coming together.
And that title bloom also suggesting some kind of natural force that happens with or without you.
Yeah.
Can you show us the next slide, Lucy? So this is a good example of, well, even in its title, it's a more explicit reference to Art Deco, which I know is a big part of your palette. But also this one, I'm not sure if I've ever said this to you, Chris, but this one reminds me of an engine block. It has this very, very brutal kind of mechanical, potentially also a kind of sci-fi quality. And I think another thing that really arrests me about your work is the way that the machine aesthetic and organic design trajectories of 20th century design history seem to fuse in your work. So I wonder what was in your, what was in your mind when you approached this particular work and its kind of mechanical brutality.
It's not as good as what's in your mind. You're so good at your interpretations. Like, I love it. I think I thought of it as kind of a sort of origins unknown, sort of imagined piece of like post-industrial equipment that had a very specific use at one point, but that fell out of that system of use and then becomes useless and is just reduced to mass and surface and texture. And what do you sort of do with it at that point? So it comes from being very sophisticated to very banal and just an end table.
That feels like a real Detroit move to me. The idea that you would look at a former moment of industrial power, which in its own time had a great deal of global influence, but has in a way become a diminished relic. And of course, Detroit has to move on to its next wave of technology, and it leaves behind it this kind of wake of industrial tools, industrial offshoots, offcuts, and products that are devalued. So that feels like it's a really local reference to me as well.
Yeah, again, your interpretations are so good. We're gonna go with that.
Lucy, can you show us the next image? Detail there, giving an incredible sense of the richness of that palette. And I think
I grew up working on a lot of those machines. So like my father, my brother, and me in the summers, we all worked in an aluminum manufacturing plant. So I worked on a lot of sort of hydraulic press machines that had, to me at that time, a real personality, and the process had a really ritualistic sort of quality to it. And I think sort of I'm remembering those machines too, and then coming here and seeing that sort of post-industrial leftover, there's a connection to it.
The building that you're in, if you go to the next image, Lucy, here we start to see some of your team at work. The building that you're in is also itself literally post-industrial and from the kind of catchment of the auto industry, correct?
Yeah, it was initially a small tool and die shop that supported the larger sort of automotive plants in the area.
Next slide, Lucy. And there's a detail of this. I think this piece also, this is like Apex aluminum foil, because here you don't have the color to kind of send you in another direction. It almost seems to be asserting the industrial quality of the foil itself, which I feel like is a really, really pure example or a pure expression of the vocabulary. And then we have this amazing table that's in a very similar idiom. I love the title of this one, Reflectory. Reminds me of a refectory table also, like from a church. I don't know if that was an intentional reference.
It was.
Yeah. Next slide, Lucy, to detail. And then that leads us very neatly to this, for me, a really important series of work, the Scrying tables. So you might just explain what Scrying is for folks. It's not a word that's in much circulation anymore.
Sure. I mean, a scrying can be I think it can be any polished surface. It can be a mirror. It could be a calm body of water. It could be a polished stone, sort of, but a very reflective surface that you can you can look into and sort of conjure a vision of the future, or conjure a spirit, or sort of a way to connect to the metaphysical.
Yeah. And there was a wizard or alchemist advisor in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. So this is in Elizabethan sort of Shakespearean times. And he had a polished obsidian mirror, which was actually Aztec, that was brought over the ocean, and he used it as a scrying mirror, as a way of telling the future, I suppose. So there's a kind of rich history of magic and what you might call occult information that leads its way into this body of work. Can you show us the next image, Lucy, because it gives a sense of the surface? And there you've done something really interesting with the tabletop, and I wonder if you could talk about that. What's happening there, what people are looking at, looking down on the object?
Yeah, there's a depth to the surface, or there's a texture happening on a layer about 3/4 of an inch below the surface, and then we're sort of layering tinted resin as we go, sort of a tinted layer, then a clear layer, tinted layer, and then ending up with this, I don't know, kind of surface of the sun, sort of textural experience that sort of adds to the mystery of it.
Yeah, I feel like these images where you see a group of people at work together start to give us a sense of the atmosphere in which the work is produced. And I wonder if you could talk now a little bit about the process of building that team and who's in the team. And maybe Lucy, you could go through the next few images that show that.
I started building my very first assistants were my neighbors that I met where I lived. So initially I worked out of my house for the first 4 or 5 years. And so I met people across the street. People would come over in the summer and just sort of check out what I was doing. And we'd hang out. And as the work started selling, I needed help. And so I hired my neighbors as my first assistants. And then it just sort of grew from there. I was teaching at the time. A couple of my students came to help. Connor, who you're looking right now, I love that guy. He's a total superstar. I don't remember how he came in, but he had there's Rahela, she lives right down the street. Connor's a really interesting example because he comes into the studio without any formal art training or background. I think he's just an inherently really talented and creative person, and just sort of takes to any process that we do. I mean, we're very self-taught in the studio. I mean, maybe I have the most training of anybody, but even that, I don't think I was never sort of a master or an expert in any one material or process, more just creatively driven. So I think we've sort of been growing the studio and taking on more of these complicated processes. So, we really love our outside collaborators who help us, make these things possible. But the closer we are to these processes ourselves, as you could imagine, the more creative control we have of that. But there's just a real spirit, I think, with the people here, and especially the makers here, of just sort of do it yourself, figure it out mentality. Rahela, for example, comes here from Bangladesh, but she has sort of a really extensive background in textiles back in Bangladesh, working in the factory there. And she specifically was in charge of quality control. So she has a really high standard of sort of materiality and process, and all these skill sets sort of translated really well into the studio.
You once remarked to me, and I found this very striking, that people ended up specializing in the various processes, which, as you say, are almost all self-invented. So the studio generates the processes as needed. And as certain staff members might be spending all day or all week doing a certain thing, they become much better at it than you are. And then you actually defer to them on the quality control and maybe even the manner in which that task is going to be executed. And I wonder if you could talk about that difficult dance of delegation and dependency that you have with the team.
But I think initially when we started it was super organic, probably too organic, just a free for all, and sort of was trying to invent in real time as we went what those processes were, and creating best practices sort of on the fly for that. And that was me kind of running around manically trying to figure it out. But I think I think the team just sort of recognized sort of their individual strengths, and people just rose to fill those sort of positions. That there was never any sort of delegating of you'll do this or you'll do that. Just what people were naturally inclined to be good at, they took over. And so we kind of developed that system together as we went. And then as we sort of mature or grew in sort of our volume, vision, and space, that people more officially started to take on those roles and sort of the authorship of sort of those parts of the process, is everything from sculpting to finishing to, business management.
And one more question about the team, Chris, and I know there's been a lot of interest in this aspect of your work. And I have to say, from a distance, I know on a day-to-day basis, it must be a real challenge just to keep things going. And there's a lot of air traffic control of making sure that pieces are getting out the door on time and that sort of thing. But it also feels like a really unusual and even almost utopian cross-cultural situation that you've built in that studio, where you do have art school graduates and people who might be coming out of the, auto industry or related trades who are working class Detroiters, and then these Bangladeshi immigrant folks that you're working with, and they're all mixing together in this one creative space. And it feels to me often when I'm there that it's almost like a model of what America should be, and maybe even thinks of itself as being, but rarely is in practice. And I know that's like a lot to lay on your doorstep, and it might be something that's happened almost intuitively over the course of the time that you've spent building the studio. But I wonder what your reflections are on the studio as a kind of ethical model for doing design and for making.
I mean, it's a beautiful thing that you're saying. And I mean, but I can't take credit for that as a model of the practice, from the beginning. Anyway, I think that variety is a reflection of what the available community looked like. I mean, that's just where we are. And that's, those are the people I met. And that was just sort of happened because they lived across the street, because it was a very word of mouth thing. The way that I was quite surprised, I think, by how well everyone sort of worked together. Like there were sort of very extreme life experiences, and people came into the studio with very different worldviews, I'd say, and how well everyone got along was, I think, just has to do with like the personality of people here. People are just so, I think, I don't know, a very real sort of instinct. They're not sort of very gun shy. Nothing kind of really frightens people here. Even with a very what would maybe to me seem an extreme condition, it'd be maybe quite normal to someone else here, right?
Yeah.
So
what you're saying is, on the one hand, there's something very specific to Detroit and that neighborhood of Detroit that expresses itself in the studio. But on the other hand, it's something that could happen anywhere if you just have an open-minded and accepting relationship to the diverse community around you. And I'm sure that's something that would happen in all corners of the country. So, one thing I find very encouraging about the way you're looking at it is that it sounds kind of easier than you might expect to build this cross-cultural coalition to do something creative.
Yeah, I think once it did start to happen, I did see the value in it happening, and realized that was an important part of the studio, and that we were very fortunate because we did start in my home. So under those conditions, things were very intimate, and you had to sort of have mutual respect for everyone in those conditions. And good luck keeping barriers in that. We start to get to know people very well and hear their life stories, and then you start to care, and then it's too late. You can't sort of go back and I should have started as a dictator and controlled everything, because now it's too late.
Some of that initial chaos was crucial for the work too, in some way. But let's talk about the show that you did. Speaking of home, here's a few images of Unhomely, the show you did a couple of years ago at Friedman Benda. And Lucy will take us through these images one by one. And so there you see the scrying table in the foreground, for example. Can you just talk a little bit about this show as a kind of culminating solo project? I guess it's your largest solo exhibition to date.
Totally.
Yeah. So seeing all this work together in one place and creating a complete atmosphere or milieu for it, for me, was very affecting and powerful. And I wonder what it did for you as a designer.
I mean, it was for us too. Like you said, it was our first and only solo show when we started working with Friedman Benda. And I mean, we were really grateful to them for giving us that opportunity and that platform to create, for the first time, a real body of work. Up to that point, it had only been a piece here and there for a show or a client, but we had never seen the work together at this scale ourselves. So it meant a lot to be able to present a body of work to an audience for review and to present it to ourselves too, to be able to stand back and look at a collection and see what have we done and where are we going. So it was, that was fantastic. And even from a production point of view, it really challenged us to sort of mature from this sort of, you know, a piece here and there to really, we kind of went from creating the short to a feature film through this experience. And that just taught us a lot about ourselves and what we could do as a team.
Can you say a little bit about the title, Unhomely? It seems like it's got a few different meanings, but I wonder what your associations are with it.
It does have a few different meanings. It's a word that I like, and I think it's a word that's easily interpretable. Right. So I don't think one specific interpretation is important. I think you could see that word and look at the show and draw some of your own conclusions. But I would offer a sort of a range of interpretation from, it could be, you could read it as very simply unhomely being the opposite of homely, of sort of simple and drab, to being very sort of extravagant and aggressive, to you could take it to a place of being sort of a mirror universe of sort of fantasy objects existing in contrast to something more sinisterly banal.
Yeah. And I suppose also because these are, at least in theory, domestic objects, there's also the sense that they would be an alien presence in that context of a home. So simultaneously functional and also in some ways a kind of interruptive or rupture kind of materialization. Also, I don't know if you speak German, Chris, but in German, there's the word unheimlich, which is unhomely, but it's a word you occasionally get in English too, meaning uncanny, or, you know, like, I think Freud liked that word a lot, you know, things that sort of played on your mind. So it feels very appropriate in that sense. Another thing that maybe folks will have noticed in these images is the presence of figuration in the work. Lucy, if you go forward through the images to the piece that's actually called Banglatown, which you see in the back there, but if you go forward in the PowerPoint, Lucy, we'll have some detail shots of it as well. That feels like a really important piece there. And I wonder whether you also would just talk about figuration. Yeah. If you would talk about figuration as a new thing that arose during the course of putting this show together, and then specifically the references that you were working with in this piece, Banglatown.
Sure. The figuration begins in that piece. It starts there and grows from there, and it comes from what you're looking at is sort of a scarecrow. Well, the entire piece is inspired by a vertical garden, which is a very common structure that you'll find in my neighborhood. So where, as I mentioned before, it's predominantly Bangladesh community, and as far as I can tell, every single home has a garden in the backyard, on the side lot, and the front lawn, anywhere that you can grow. And these gardens are constructed from materials that are sort of gathered from the area, whether in sort of an adjacent lot or a burnt down house or in the alleyways. And whatever can sort of be gathered is sort of lashed and bound together into these structures that sort of grow or graft onto the existing architecture or any sort of nearby infrastructure. And when they're sort of naked or undressed, and the winter and fall, they have this kind of very dystopic vibe. But in the spring, summer, and it turns into a total green utopia when they're just sort of growing in squash and beans, and you'll see everyone outside sort of harvesting from rooftops and fence lines, and it's a really sort of incredible experience and transition. But so this is inspired by those structures, and I specifically love the scarecrow because so for every garden you need a scarecrow, and every family interprets that scarecrow form a little differently, and it's a bizarre object to me in that, well, I think it sort of locally can come to like symbolize something of sort of resilience on sort of on the fringes of a city, but I also think it's this really interesting object in this pretty rare category of figurative sculpture, usually done by sort of, let's say, an amateur, but it has this function as a designed object. So if we say it's a functional figurative sculpture, it becomes very interesting, and that it's made to communicate with another species as well.
Yeah, so that function is actually aimed at non-humans. Yeah. And there's also a very interesting thing here about the question of contributions from the team. And, you know, we talked last week with Isha Khan about what he did in South Africa, working with basket weavers and other artisans there, and the difficult situation that you might find yourself in his case, dropping down into a situation and trying to work with those craft techniques respectfully. You obviously have built your own situation, and it's a much more permanent, sustained, and sustainable practice in some ways than any travel to another part of the world that's only a temporary situation could be. But I know that for you, the idea of using a specifically Bangladeshi vernacular reference, even if it wasn't necessarily something that people would pick up as such, was kind of a big deal, right? To be able to actually cross that threshold in terms of the iconography.
It was. So I guess you could, if you remember the blue mirror we were discussing, and sort of, I was sort of abstractly dealing with that influence between sort of this codependent relationship between the two things coming together. But I wanted to sort of take on the inspiration sort of head on and see how that worked out. In the process of making this, I did work with the team here, my group of Bengali ladies, to fashion the scarecrow. So we work sort of handing back and forth the object, you know, sort of understanding how they did it, and then modifying it and turning it into more of a process and not just a sort of recreation.
Yeah, I think that conversational quality in the work, and again, if anyone has a chance to visit Chris in the studio, you'll really feel that it's an ongoing exchange, and it seems like it's getting more and more that way in the studio as time goes on, as you feel more and more comfortable integrating those contributions. To me, would you agree with that?
Yeah, we are, and in different ways. So this was like one way to do that, but we thought that there must be other ways to sort of collaborate and build on those relationships. So then actually, this was, you and I had a wonderful studio visit, and it was after a discussion I had with you, they're always so fruitful, that I started thinking about how do we build on the skill sets that we have within the studio to really collaborate to create something new. Yeah. And we started experimenting with just sort of not imagery or narrative, but coming just from process. How do we collaborate to create something unique in the studio that is a real combination of our talents?
So Lucy, maybe you could just go through the last few images one by one, just to show us that. So here we see some more of the figurative work coming through, particularly powerful work that seems like it could perhaps be a self-portrait of a sort. And I just wonder whether we just got about 5 minutes here before we take questions. So folks who are listening, please think about what questions you might want to ask and put them in the chat box. But I wonder what you might say about where the studio is going now and what these more recent projects have brought to you.
I think now, I mean, I've been asking myself for a while, sort of, you know, where do we go with this, or what's next, and what's important to me, what's important to the group. And it sort of determined that those relationships are important, and how do I lean into those relationships, both in the studio, within my personal life, within my friends and mentors like yourself, and my family, and like my mother, and how does sort of the work become a medium to connect more to people and build those relationships, build the work out of those relationships. So that, like in the case with the ladies in the studio, we're doing that through process. I'm doing it with, I'm doing some projects with my mother that are a little more illustrative, and just sort of approaching at it through a few different levers to try to see what comes of that, you know, where it's not just like a pure force coming directly just from me, but it's sort of connecting more and then coming back together to make something different.
That it's wonderful to hear you talk about your mother. I feel like we should get every guest on the show to talk about their mother. But the illustrative aspect of what you're doing also has come to the fore. And a drawing went past a minute ago too. But that's something you've been doing a lot of recently, but you have long been very, very interested in drawing, and you do very fine, detailed renderings that aren't necessarily design drawings for the work, but sort of happen alongside the work. And I wonder if you could talk about that drawing practice and whether you feel like it's becoming more central over time, or just it has a kind of different relationship to the sculptural and 3D qualities of the furniture.
I mean, drawing for me is it's the oldest part of me that I know. It's the first thing that I did and, you know, continue to do. So it's the one through line throughout my entire life. So it's very, very familiar to me, and it has, it enters the practice in like many different ways. So it's purely like visionary and speculative to sort of develop new ideas. It's like a communication tool to sit down with the team and try to explain what it is that I'm thinking. I think I draw better than I talk. And then it could also just be a very practical engineering tool, right? Sort of how do we build the vision? But it's just, for me, it dovetails. I can oscillate back and forth from the 2D to 3D pretty effortlessly, just because the muscle memory is just really built in.
Yeah, totally. I love this last image too, because it gives you this sense of like the still life of like what every surface in your studio is like.
Yeah. I think those are better than the work sometimes. I'm like, why can't it be as good as the sample table?
That's so interesting, because every studio visit you do, there is that, sometimes you talk about it and sometimes you don't, but so often it's like, how do you get the energy of the studio and the physicality of the studio into the work when it goes out into a white box gallery? How do you get it to telegraph? But, you know, another thing I wanted to say, Chris, before we get to the questions, is that I think often in the broader art world, it seems like there's a choice that has to be made between social practice and all of the ethics and morality and politics that comes with that, or aesthetics and formalism and objects that have a kind of autonomous orientation to beauty or some other kind of powerful aesthetic statement. And I always feel like the practices that really grab me and become meaningful to me are the ones that manage to do both of those things at the same time, that are both social practice and aesthetic practice in equal measure, and also where those two things reinforce and support one another. And for my money, that's what I absolutely see coming out of your work. So that's, you know, it's been tremendously significant to me, and getting to know you over the last few years has been a huge pleasure. So just wanted to say that before turning to questions. And I think we'll do that now, if that's okay with you, Chris.
Sure.
So first we have, is Elisa Author still with us?
Still here, yeah.
This also gives us the opportunity to break some news. And Chris, maybe we should let you do that. So there's going to be an exhibition coming up, and I wonder if you just let people know about that before Elisa asks her question.
Yes, we are doing a solo exhibition at the Museum of Art and Design in New York City, and opening, I believe, October 2021.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very excited about that.
So joining.
Pardon me?
Thanks for joining us.
Oh, sure. No, this was a great conversation. I just had a question, a really basic question about your color palette, because it's so distinctive. And of course, it takes you from a lot of the narratives that you've talked about in sometimes really different directions, like sci-fi, for instance.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about the palette? Like, how do you develop the palette, and you know, do you think of it as something you have to generate separately and then bring to the work, or how does the color work for you?
Each color is really specific to the form. Sometimes it's clear from the beginning, even in a sketch form, before it even takes any three-dimensionality. Sometimes it's a struggle up until it's ready for color. So it's a really intuitive process. There is not a clear roadmap for the right form to color relationship. It's a vibe. Sometimes it could take on, if it's in the sense of, if I'm finding a form sort of too aggressive and I'm losing the sort of the message of the material, then I might sort of tone it down and color. So you can consider the form and, you know, I'll take the edge off, or vice versa. I maybe want something sort of discreet to have a bit of a louder voice or be a little more aggressive, so I can make it louder. But it's a very sort of case by case.
It's funny that you describe it as so ad hoc, because it comes out feeling like a really well worked out, quite specific palette. Maybe it's the same thing that happens with painters, like every decision feels very individual. What did you think of that?
What do I think of that?
I was asking Elisa whether she agreed with me.
Oh yeah, no, I do feel that it's really distinctive and very specific. So I'm surprised to hear that it's something that you see as more intuitive and coming out of the form itself. That wouldn't have occurred to me at all.
I like your flowers.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, if I'm going to risk my life going to the grocery store, I might as well get tulips, right?
I bought dead flowers. The last time I went, just all dead things. You just put in the thing with no water. I thought that was really smart. Yours are prettier. Yours are prettier.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, adding some class to the occasion as always, Elisa. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the question. And thanks for the museum show.
Yeah, and I should also mention that the show is curated by Andrew Blauvelt, our curator, our design curator at large. So we're really excited. From your alma mater, from Cranbrook.
We should mention Andrew's fantastic, and it's been a great collaboration so far, because he's here in Detroit and in New York, so he gets to come into the studio and get to work really closely.
Yeah.
What's the show going to be called, Chris?
The title is Off World.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's a really nice echo of Unhomely. It's like, like the macroscopic version of the same title in a way. It's very clever.
It's another sort of sci-fi term. It comes up on TNG a lot. So it's just sort of anything that's not native to this planet.
TNG.
So I'm not off with seeing the sci-fi reference in your work. Okay, good.
Sorry.
No, I knew that acronym. TNG is Star Trek: The Next Generation. I just wanted,
You want to make sure everyone else knew?
Yeah, well, some people who were listening probably weren't born when Next Generation was being broadcast.
I grew up on TNG. Sort of Roddenberry sort of sci-fi philosophies were, really inspirational.
Right. Okay, let's go to Seth Nagelberg next. A question about furniture as strategy. Seth, do we still have you?
I'm here. I don't know how to work my mic. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
I think that is the question. So I want to know why you chose the format of furniture, and do you think of it as the subject or a strategy, meaning furniture is how I'm going to send my ideas out to the world?
It's good. It's a great question. I started my whole sort of education and practice up to coming to Cranbrook was that of primarily a sculptor. And I was sort of dancing, I think, around issues of architecture and design from a very amateur perspective, without sort of only understanding it through my own personal experiences. And I was, and had this vision in my mind that I was creating sort of interactive sort of works or jigs for the human body, or things that you could sort of touch and experience. But it never felt sort of explicit enough. And I worked as an art handler for years at MoMA, PS1, and specifically at MoMA, there was this, you'd get to spend time with the collection on your own if you were like sort of lucky enough, where it was like the most VIP access in the world. So you're unaccompanied by a security guard or another peer, and you'd go in and dust the collection and by extension touch it. And I think that was an extremely powerful sort of moving experience. And I wanted that I wanted to sort of recreate that and keep having that experience. And I thought design, and I think the way you put it was really kind of spot on. Where so the furniture is the medium that I found to work in, because it allowed that experience to happen, and sort of that touch and that discovery or that negotiation with the object. It made it okay, and it made it approachable. And no matter sort of how alien or bizarre it looks, at the end of the day, it's a furniture object. In my case, and that allows anyone sort of from any background or education level to understand it as a chair or a table at some level, and then experience the materiality after that.
Awesome, thank you. I'm sure that's something that a lot of the people we'll be talking to on this series could say as well. That idea of furniture or other functional design forms as a strategy or a kind of mechanism or platform for getting these other things across that a painter, a sculptor, or an architect might equally be interested in. So it's really interested to hear your take on that. We have an important question from Juliana Wisdom about the collaborative studio and how you conceive your own role. Juliana, are you with us?
I am, yeah, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just, as you were talking about just the way your studio works, I couldn't help but wonder how you consider, your responsibility as an employer. I worked in a very similar type of studio as an employee in LA, and that became a really important part. Sometimes it was tense, and a lot of times it ended up being really positive. Just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. It's something I think about a lot, actually. I started off as an independent artist in an independent practice, and that was always my vision for myself, is to be entirely independent and not a collaborator and not a part of anything, a community especially. And so that's been a big learning curve of moving here and starting the studio here. It's not something I'm comfortable with. So I had to get comfortable with that idea. So it was like a big sort of personal growth component to that, and learning how to be a part of the group, sort of set the tone, but then be a part of it. And the responsibility level is also quite high, and that I would say sort of historically, I would be quite maybe a destructive person from time to time, or maybe willing sort of to risk everything, because the sort of the aftermath of that would only affect me. But I became aware at some point when maybe I was being reckless, that there was now sort of this team of people that my actions would affect. And that it meant that it didn't mean that I couldn't take risks in the work, but that, well, I had to be sort of emotionally sort of mature and responsible with my decision making, so that I didn't do anything that was going to jeopardize the studio. So it changes you, and it changed me, and I take the responsibility very seriously, especially right now, sort of what we're going through and how to sort of manage this situation and my team, and how we best sort of get through this together. But it is at this point a very sort of close knit group that feels more family than just transactional relationships. So I think I'm quite relieved that I have their support and that we have such a strong connection, but quite concerned like everyone else.
Peter Fleming, you had also asked a quick question about toxic materials. And Peter, are you with us? Do you want to join in?
Hey, sure. Hi, Glenn. Hi, Chris. Yeah, I mean, I'm an educator. I head a furniture program just outside of Toronto, Ontario, and we're always dealing with the challenges of how we manage potentially toxic materials and so on. And the forms you've created are impossible to create in any other way other than the process you've done. So they have an amazing architectural and lyrical quality that is really arresting. I guess I had a question. I mean, when you started talking about creating these objects first at home and now in a better, more industrial facility, you know, I obviously have a concern about how you manage the potential toxicity of materials and so on.
That's a real concern, and something we try to get better at all the time. Yeah, initially, if we got inspected, we would have been shut down like right away. This is totally bad form. We did everything we could. So, I mean, we would work outside when we could and vent how we could. Fortunately, like what you may think is the most toxic material, our resins, has a no VOC, no volatile organic compound. We still work in a ventilated area when we do that. Now that's if you believe all the data on the material, right? But I mean, running a table saw is toxic, you know, if you don't do it right. So we invest in the infrastructure of the studio as much as we can to, you know, to address the health and safety as much as possible. And that's just everyone sort of doing the best they can, you know, wearing a respirator when you're supposed to. And I think a lot of the materials too, I think about it sort of are already inherently sort of toxic, where sort of we collect and gather a lot of materials that are sort of organic, but also post-industrial objects, and sort of cutting into them and using them is toxic. So but there's something that I like about those materials too, sort of whether you have sort of a protagonist and antagonist sort of coming together, and that just because those materials are toxic by nature doesn't we don't exclude them. They're part of that story. They exist. They're accessible. They're within arm's reach, and so they have to be dealt with and sort of brought in and used. And yeah, there is a risk factor and a responsibility factor with that, but it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for that question, Peter. Just two more questions before we come to time. Scott Linker, you had a question for us about the subtractive and additive forms of the...
Scott Clinker, you say?
Sorry?
Did you say Scott Clinker?
Scott Clinker, yes.
Professor Cranbrook.
Scott, are you with us?
Can you hear me now?
We can. How you doing?
Okay. Hi, guys. Thanks for doing this. Yeah, I just had a general question about the actual sculpting of these pieces. So they appear to be the result of a pretty intensive craft process of probably both additive and subtractive processes. And we've seen a lot of images of the finishing work on the pieces. But I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the actual sculpting.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, Scott. Hi, Scott. It varies from piece to piece. So sometimes it's more sort of material driven by sort of what we have at hand. Sometimes it comes from, I'll have a more precise image or drawing that I'm trying to reach. So in that sense, I'll just carve by hand. There's no sort of shortcut there. One of the earlier images we had was me the second image was me working on a form, and that was a figure. So in that process, we would create a frame and sort of mass it in the material, and then I shape it back to the figure, and then clad that entire structure with sticks and woods that sort of collected from the yard in the area. And that becomes a really sort of interesting game of sort of trying to find the right material for the right part of the form. So it's pretty intuitive at that point. It's sort of collecting the best things and having great material at hand that's inspiring, but then just getting into that process is pretty automatic and intuitive, and getting into that zone and finding that time is probably the most exciting and fulfilling part of the practice. But there's also techniques that are sort of taught across the studio, right? So I can't make every single piece. I take on my pieces a few at a time that I'll develop, especially works that are a bit ahead of the curve of what the studio is used to or I've presented. And together we'll work to sort of develop other sort of techniques and processes that I don't have to personally work on every piece. And that really sort of develops this sort of the relationship and, you know, between the team members and our sort of material language. And that's there's sort of different modes of working.
So it's an ever evolving repertoire, really.
Yeah. And we sort of retire some things and just kind of keep going.
Cool. Thank you, Scott. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, sure.
To reforge that connection. And we'll just take one last question from John Prown, coming from Milwaukee.
Yep, how are you doing? Hi, Scott and Chris, how are you? Just real quick, first of all, I think in this current, just an observation, in this current moment, not just the moment of the crisis, but also sort of our current political, economic, judicial moment, it just seems like the kind of inclusive, diverse environment you're setting up is all the more important. I think all of that is under such threat, and projects like yours become real models for others to think about. In a question about sort of the unheimlich, the notion of the uncanny just seems so appropriate because there's this real time traveling aspect to your work. And as an art historian, for example, I just see you making such wonderful references to all sorts of stylistic and world making traditions. Like the orange and yellow machine block piece, to me, looks like just the perfect sort of classical column from Detroit, right? It's this weird survivor, as if it fell off a building. Or like the grotto piece. I mean, the grotto is this wonderful timeless illusion. And I was just sort of curious if you could say a little bit more about the way you get inspired by works from history, because I just seem to see you playing and exploring and developing so much on what's been done in the past.
I mean, I think you framed the work really well. I think that's a really good sort of understanding of the form, and the way that I think about it or sometimes describe it is a lot like what you said, is that it could sort of come from an imagined past or for a future home that we don't quite have yet or something. So it's sort of oscillating between sort of these times. And art historically, I mean, right now, not I guess so much looking at specifically architectural references. I mean, right now my influences are sort of leaning more towards the figurative, wrapped up in kind of like Camille Claudel, Lipschitz, with like some H.R. Geiger mixed in. So it's like these sort of awkward romantic things with like a sex cyber pop kind of edge to it. So but in that sense, it's sort of, it can be anywhere and coming from sort of anything. But I do like this idea of sort of the imagined artifact, where you can sort of maybe program or imagine sort of the ritual, and it can be this sort of eccentric sort of object.
I want to go to that Lipschitz, Claudel, Geiger cocktail party.
Yeah.
And your furniture will be there for the serving, right? Okay, thank you, John. Also, thanks to Alanis for her question. She said that we had already answered it, so that's commendable efficiency on our part. Chris, last thing I want to say is thank you very much. And out there, everyone, thanks for joining us. Come on back next week. As I said at the beginning, we're going to have 3 guests next week, and we'll be keeping to that increased schedule for the duration of the lockdown. And so we'll be having Zoe Ryan from the Art Institute of Chicago on Monday, and then we will have Faye Too Good on Wednesday, and then finally Humberto Campana from the Campana Brothers on Friday, always at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And watch both the Friedman Bende Instagram and my Instagram for the links for those. And thanks everyone for being here, and help me thank Chris for his fantastic contribution today and conversation.
Thanks, Glenn. I always enjoy talking to you.
Likewise.
Okay, look forward to seeing you on the other side.
Congratulations.